Brother Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick is a globally renowned Islamic scholar, historian, educator, and community leader. He has a PhD in history with a specialization in West African Islamic history from the University of Toronto. He is a senior lecturer at the Al-Maghrib Institute and the Islamic Institute of Toronto. Dr. Quick is an honorary chief in Sierra Leone and an honorary member of the Order of Arctic Adventures and a recipient of Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Please welcome Brother Abdullah. Abdullah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala sayyidil awwaleen wal akhirin. Nabiyana Muhammadan wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be upon all of the prophets, and especially our beloved Prophet Muhammad, the master of the first and the last, and his family and his companions to the day of judgment. My beloved brothers and sisters, to our friends, to our guests, I begin with the greeting words of the righteous. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And these are the words of peace, and I pray that this initiative taken up by Islam Unravelled will be a source of peace and a source of understanding. And it's very important that this is taking place at a time when the COVID-19 has locked down people throughout the world, and the economic recession is rising, and there is tension, a rise in racial tension. And we find ourselves now in Black History Month. And so things are coming together, and it's important for us to look at our challenges and then to celebrate the beautiful history and the culture that we have. One of the founders of Black History Month, Carter G. Woodson, in the United States, he made a number of statements. One of them is that if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated. So literally, what he was talking about is an organized move to wipe out the history of African people and Black people, especially in the West, in order to maintain a type of white supremacy. And this is a challenge that we have to recognize and face as we celebrate. And that is that we are living in a time of white supremacy, of racism. And racism has got three parts to it. The basis is ideas. Racism is an ideology that one group feels it is superior to another group, and it's justified in doing what it does. This ideology, in many cases, expresses itself with words, expressions. And this is what most people think racism is. They think it's just racist words that you're calling, or names that you're calling people. That's just a section. But the most dangerous part of it today for us is what we know as institutionalized racism. And that is where the color of your skin, your ethnicity, something about your physical self can actually determine your value in a society. And so when we think of racism, we have to think about the three areas. But today we want to look at the ideology, because the basis of white supremacy is an ideology. And this is where the curriculum is so important, Brother Makiel Simpson, and the work that you're doing is so vital, because we are living in what you could call a type of Eurocentric discourse. That is where Europe has been placed in the center of the world, and everybody else is on the periphery. And just to give you an example of this, because it's an exhaustive topic, I grew up in America with the statement that Columbus discovered America in 1492. But we know the reality is that Columbus was lost, and he bumped into America on his way to India and called the people Indians. He didn't know where he was. And so when we deconstruct history, when we take it apart and then put it back together in a more objective way, we could say that Columbus was discovered in 1492. You see the difference between the two? Because now you are taking into the facts, or you are taking into consideration the fact that the First Nations people lived in this part of the world, some say between 10 to 20,000 years. There were over 73 million indigenous people living in the Americas when Columbus came to this part of the world. So how can you say he discovered the place? But this has been enshrined within historical curriculums all over the world, and it's only now being erased. And so with this in mind, we want to look at Africa itself, because this is our challenge we're looking at tonight. Because European writers, they would depict Africa as a dark place, as a backward place. And one of the so-called great historians, Arnold Toynbee, even said that Africa has done nothing for the onward flow of civilization. I want to celebrate with you when we start unpacking this. Let's look at the map itself. The maps that we're using of Africa are distorted. The real map, the real reality, you can put India and China into Africa and you still have room. It is a huge place. And if we go back in time to move along in history, celebrating our Blackness, celebrating the achievements of Black people, we need to go back almost 5,000 years. When we go back to ancient Egypt, and this is a map of ancient Egypt where you would see Upper Egypt is the bottom part and lower is the top, because the Nile flows from south to north, because the mountains are in Kenya and in Uganda. And so it was around the year 3200 BC that Namir, or Menes, the Pharaoh of Egypt, he united Upper and Lower Egypt and made it one of the most powerful political entities in the world. That's 3200 BC. Now, this is an actual bust of the face of Menes himself. And when you look at his face, you can see clearly this is an African man. And that is the reality of the early Egyptian civilization, that it came from the south and it went north. And that is an amazing thing, but not just alone, the fact that he united Upper and Lower Egypt. By 2650 BC, let's celebrate. The Black Egyptians built the step pyramid of Saqqara. And this building, which is an amazing structure, is still there today. This is a recent shot. If you have a building in Vancouver that's 100 years old, it's a national monument. This is over 5,000 years old, and it is still standing. Look at the structure. Look at the work that they did underneath the building. I traveled to Saqqara myself, went down to the bottom of the pyramid, and you find rooms like this with ancient hieroglyphics and decimal points and so many different amazing bits of information. Let's take it a step further in our celebration. We're going to ride on our camels and we'll go to a place called Giza. And in Giza, we find the Great Pyramid of Giza. 2560 BC, this pyramid was constructed. Now, for most people, we don't even think in terms of BC. We think people that humans were cavemen in BC. But this pyramid was built for a great African Muslim or African leader, Egyptian leader, whose name was Khufu. Now look closely at his face. That is an African man, not how it's depicted in the movies, where you will see Egyptians depicted as Mediterranean people. This is an African people. Take off his hat and put on a baseball cap. And he looks like, there's a famous basketball player, LeBron James, right? He looks like somebody, an African person today. This is a great leader. Look at the structure that was built as a national project. If you focus on this shot of the Great Pyramid, look down in the middle, the white little dot, that's a water truck. So try to understand how big this building is. It had 2,300,000 blocks of granite. The corners were perfect right angles. They faced north, south, east, and west. It was the largest building in the world to the 18th century. The bricks, in some cases, were 20 tons. And if you don't believe how big it is, look at this brick. That's me in the picture. 20 tons. How did African people take granite from Aswan in the south, carry it north, and build a structure that nobody has been able to reproduce up until today? By the year 2000, great universities had developed, one called Karnak in 2000 BC. I want you to look at the columns inside of this temple or this university in Karnak. Compare this to the Greeks. Now, we are taught within our present curriculums that science and math came from the Greeks and then from the Romans, but the ancient Greeks were not racist people. The Greeks said we got our civilization from the Egyptians, and they were dark-skinned people with curly hair. They had no problem with this. Now, let's go back in BC. Remember, 2650 BC, the Great Pyramid. You got to go about 2,000 years later to 700 BC, then the Greek civilization starts. Let's take another look at the Stonehenge. This was the height of British civilization back in BC. Compare the Stonehenge to the Great Pyramid, and then we can begin to see how history has been distorted and the work that we have to do to deconstruct the lies and bring it in a more neutral, positive way that our young people can take it. Taking it a step further to the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, because this is partly connected with Islam Unravelled. And even Muslims will be surprised to know that Black people in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were not weak people. The word aswad in Arabic has a number of meanings. You can say sawad, meaning blackness. When you say al-aswadan, that refers to dates and water, which are two good things. If you talk about sada yasudu sayyid, aswad refers to power, to mastery. Your sayyid is your master. As-sawad al-a'zam is a majority. So Black people and Blackness was not a negative thing in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. As a matter of fact, it is reported that in the 5th year of the prophethood, that's around 615 AD, after Prophet Muhammad was calling to the oneness of God, he was breaking down racial differences, he was breaking down class differences between rich and poor, and so he was persecuted. And his followers were tortured so bad that he said to them, you can now go in a type of migration. And so they took refuge, not in Syria, not in Iraq, not in Pakistan, not in Malaysia or Turkey. They took refuge in Africa. This is called the first hijrah, the first migration. And you'll see it on your map. They went across from where Jeddah is today, and then down to present-day Eritrea on the coastline, and they went up into the highlands of present-day Ethiopia, and they found the Aksumite Empire. The Aksumite Empire was considered to be one of the greatest empires in the ancient world. And the prophet said to his people, if you go to Abyssinia, it would be better for you, for in it there is a king who will not tolerate oppression. It is a land of truth. Go there until such time as Allah shall relieve your distress. He said, Hiya ardu sidq. He's talking about Africa now. It is a land of truth. This is an Arabian prophet who sends his followers as refugees into Africa to a Christian king whose title was An-Najashi, or the Negus. His name was Ashama. They had an amazing society, the largest obelisk in the world. You see the obelisk there. They had amazing technology. And Najashi, he gave sanctuary to the Muslims. And they were able to stay there for a period of time. This is a masjid, Najashi in northern Ethiopia. People are suffering there now. Unfortunately, it is in Tigray land because Najashi was Tigray. And but still, it's an amazing story. Ashama Before he died, he embraced Islam. And the proof of that is that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made the janazah prayer for him in absentia, janazah lil ghaib, first time it was ever done. And he goes down in history as one of our great leaders. 15 Sahabas died there in Ethiopia. But what a lot of Muslims don't realize, and history books generally don't record, is that 32 Abyssinians, Ethiopians, migrated to Medina when the large migration went from Mecca to Medina. And amongst the early Sahaba, there were many male and female, because generally when people speak about Black Muslims or Blackness in the time of the Prophet, they say Bilal. And no doubt, Bilal is an important thing. But did you know that Bilal had a sister whose name was Ghafira? Did you know that Bilal had a brother named Khalid? Did you know that the mother, the second mother of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Ayman Baraka, the dry nurse who later became like his mother when his original mother Amina died, she was an Ethiopian. Did you realize how many of the people there? I want to give you just some of the names because this is a big study. Julaybib, Sa'd al-Aswad, Salim Mola Abi Hudayfa is one of the top 5 masters of the Quran. He was a Black man. Usama ibn Zayd, Muhajah, who was the first martyr or shaheed in the Battle of Badr. Mughith, Muhammad ibn Maslama, the knight of the Prophet. Ubadah ibn Samit, radiallahu anhum ajma'in. These were the followers in the first generation that's considered to be the best generation. But they were under attack. The Romans attacked from the north, the Persians attacked from the east, and they responded to the attacks, and they defeated the Byzantine Romans and found out that the people were suffering under oppression. And so the Egyptian people, the Coptics at the time, called for the Muslims. And Amr ibn al-As, radiallahu anh, was sent into Egypt. Muslims started to take away all of the holdings of the Byzantines. You look at the map where it's dark green, and you'll see where Islam spread. Within 100 years, it had reached these lands. When the Muslims reached to a place called Ifriqiya, that's the first modern use of the word Africa, and it was the word for Tunisia, Tunis at the time, they recognized that there was gold coming from the south below the Sahara. The greatest gold mines in the world at the time were coming from the Senegal, below the Senegal and below the Niger River. Great empires were developed, and let's celebrate some of these great empires. The West African Empire of Ghana, of Takroa, of Mali, of Songhai. There are so many amazing stories in West African history and African history in general. One of the facts which is interesting for the young people, and if you Google it, just when you get a chance, put it in your phone. Who was the richest man who ever lived? Was it Jeff Bezos? No. The richest man who ever lived was Mansa Musa. This was the emperor or the emir of Mali, and he had more gold than anybody, pound for pound. He is the richest person ever lived in history. And he made pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 with over 72,000 followers. Mansa Musa, when he returned from Mecca, remember he had so much gold, he was changing the economy of every country that he lived, that he reached. He used the gold strategically, and he brought back books, scholars, architects, missionaries. And when he came to the top of the desert there, the Niger, he fell in love with a city called Timbuktu. And Timbuktu is not a joke. We used to say when I was young, oh, go to Timbuktu. I mean, oh, get lost. Timbuktu was a great center of trade where the camel met the canoe. It also became a center of learning. And it was recognized by the sultans of Morocco, the Ottoman Empire, of the Turks, throughout the world. By the 16th century, Timbuktu had the Sankore University, which had over 25,000 students, 150 small Quran schools, around it. Think about this. 1500s, no Oxford, no Sorbonne, no University of Toronto. Black African Muslim students were studying not only religious studies, they were studying astronomy and studying math. That's a celebration. And Arnold Toynbee would turn over in his grave if the reality got out to the world that knowledge did not go from north south, that knowledge actually went from south north. But eventually, when the trade routes changed to the oceans and the Muslim nations became weak because of internal weaknesses, the European nations became strong. And the Atlantic slave trade began. And this is where Europe then sent their boats to West Africa and Central Africa on the coastlines, and they stole people, they captured people, they bartered with one tribe against another, and they were able to bring millions of people across the Atlantic into South America, the Caribbean, United States, and yes, even Canada, because Canada had slaves as well. Countless numbers of people died in the Middle Passage, and we celebrate their resistance. We celebrate their dignity that they had, and all the way through, they never bowed down. They struggled, and what we are recognizing today is that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the enslaved Africans and political prisoners were actually Muslims. And we're able to trace their stories because they were writing in Arabic language, their local language, Arabic, and their writings are existing today. And we're able to follow their stories. There's a number of eyewitness reports, written documents, autobiographies, records. It has come to the surface, more and more information. I want to just celebrate for a moment with a few of the people. Abdurrahman ibn Ibrahim, he was born in Timbo, that's in Guinea. Now he was in 1762, educated in Timbuktu. He was enslaved in Mississippi, but he returned home in 1829. The first country to recognize the United States was Morocco, the Sultan of Morocco. And it was a treaty between George Washington and the Sultan that any Muslim who was captured should be released. And when they found out about Abdurrahman, the government, they released him. Ayub ibn Sulaiman, who was born in 1700 in Bundu, eastern Senegal. He was a scholar who prayed 5 times a day, even in slavery. He wrote the whole Quran from his memory. He was recognized also by the United States government. He returned back to West Africa. Omar ibn Sayyid, who wrote his own biography in Arabic, and it still exists today in the museums in the United States. Oh, Lizzie Gray, a Muslim woman in South Carolina. Fatima or Phoebe, these are known Muslim women in the Sapelo Islands off the coast of Georgia. Francois Macandal, born in Guinea, and bookmen. They were marabout, what is called marabout. They were traveling clerics, and they were the ones who helped to initiate the Great Revolution in Haiti. And Toussaint Louverture, took this rebellion and organized it to liberate Haiti for the first time from colonialism. The Maroon resistance in Jamaica. We recognize and we celebrate Nanny of the Maroons, a Jamaican hero. Also Sam Sharp. And I had the opportunity to live in Jamaica and travel high up into the Cockpit Mountains. And there is a Jumu'ah hole. There is a place where Muslims would make their prayers. There is Arabic writings amongst the Maroons. But it has been recorded that the Maroons won their freedom. But in 1795, the British tricked them and they made a treaty. And so the Trelawney Maroons, many of them were brought to Canada, to Nova Scotia, and stayed for a period of time. And there is a rich history of African people and Muslims also who were in Nova Scotia. Many of them went on to Sierra Leone. Also during this slavery period, there were other Muslims whose stories are now coming out in Canada. Because when slavery was eventually abolished, It was not because the European colonialists loved the African people. No, it was because the rebellions were reaching the level that they couldn't take it anymore, and it wasn't viable financially. And so they were great abolitionists. In America, they are recognized in Harriet Tubman. She would take the slaves on the Underground Railroad, hiding in people's homes, and they would come all the way up to Canada. Frederick Douglass, and it's interesting because when Frederick Douglass' family has been investigated, his mother came from the Bailey family who came on the same Georgia coast, and they were from Saleh Bilali, and so he actually has Muslim roots within his family as well, a great leader. And so people suffered and traveled on the Underground Railroad. And they made it to the north, way up to Canada. They struggled as much as they could, but slavery was a terrible thing. And people suffered. They lost their language, lost their religion. Families were broken up. Their original lifestyle was only a distant memory in some cases. But that resilience, we celebrate today the resilience of the African people who were able to maintain their dignity and suffer through slavery. And eventually, after it was supposedly ended, the Reconstruction period, the Jim Crow period, these are important times to study and to understand that up until today, there is still a form of slavery that goes on, an economic slavery, a mental slavery. That's the reason why when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," and everybody said it around the world, it's not just physically breathing. I can't breathe spiritually. I can't breathe educationally. I can't breathe in my lifestyle. But we celebrate on this occasion some of the inventions of Black people. Now, you would think after all of this slavery, after millions of people dying, after your culture being destroyed, you would be a useless people. But I want to celebrate to you some of the inventions made by Black people. And this is a shock for some Muslims too, right? Because they're not aware, of the reality of African people in this part of the world. Think about this. The automatic gear shift was invented by Richard Spikes in 1932. He was a Black man. Elijah McCoy, who's a Canadian Black man who went to America. He was famous for over 57 US patents. He was so famous in dealing with the lubrication of steam engines that people would say when they got an engine or a train, "Is it the real McCoy?" And we used to say that when I was young, growing up in America. The real McCoy. In other words, is it something that Elijah McCoy had his hand in? But how many people would think that Elijah McCoy was a Black man? Because McCoy is an Irish name, right? So how many people would think he was a Black man, Canadian? Your ironing board. Think how life would be if Black people didn't make certain inventions. The ironing board was done by Sarah Boone. Garrett Morgan developed the gas mask, traffic signals, your signal light, stop at red, slow down at yellow. It was a Black man who invented this. Charles Drew, he developed the blood bank. Look how important the blood bank is today. Shirley Jackson, major developed touch tone telephones, caller ID, fiber optics. Think about this. After all this destruction, Black people are still making major inventions. I'll just list a few because of our time. The automatic elevator doors, Alexander Miles. Clothes dryer, George T. Sampson. Electric lamp, Louis Latimer. Folding chairs, John Purdy. The lawnmower, Albert Burr. The mop, Thomas Stewart. Potato chips, George Crumb. What would our life be without potato chips? America's first modern clock, Benjamin Banneker. The mailbox, Philip Downey. This is just a few of the hundreds of inventions that have been made. So our people are still strong, our legacy continues, and we remember through the example of Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, one of the great African Muslims. And many people know Malcolm X with a nice suit on and a bow tie, but this is Malcolm before he died. He has the clothes of the scholars of West Africa. What is in his hand? It's a book. It's education. And it is through education and deconstruction of history, we can take down the ideology of white supremacy and then help people to appreciate each other. That Canada and other places can be a country where we can hold hands together in dignity and we don't assume the wrong thing about each other, but we will celebrate the achievements made by all human beings. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. And I want to congratulate Islam Unravelled, and I pray that Allah will continue to bless you. Thank you very much for your time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.